This video will introduce you to Buddhism, another very ancient religion of our world. It's not the largest, it's the fourth largest after Christianity and Islam and Hinduism. And this lecture also is not meant to be exhaustive. Again, it's only to help you approach your reading and serve as a but very brief introduction to Buddhism. But Buddhism, to begin, is a path of practice and spiritual development that has developed over about the last 2,500 years. This religion does have a founder, unlike Hinduism that we previously talked about, and his name is Siddhartha Gautama. He was a prince of Nepal. He lived about between the 6th and 4th century before the Common Era. But Siddhartha Gautama did not claim to be any sort of prophet or god or divinity. He simply said that he was a human being who came to study and understand life in the deepest possible way, and he awoke to that truth. Buddha, then, that he started to refer himself as, is simply a word or name that means awake. That is, he woke up to the reality of what he discovered and shared it with other humans, and it continues to be shared to this day. Before we get to that, let's first talk about, well, who was Siddhartha Gautama? Like I said, Siddhartha Gautama was raised as a prince in Nepal, that little sliver of a country between modern-day India and China. And his first, I believe it was 27 years of life as a prince, he had everything he wanted. All-out indulgence, hedonism, unrivaled luxury, materialism, and yet he said in his late 20s that despite all of these earthly and carnal indulgences, he wasn't happy. He wasn't at peace. There was something missing. So the Prince of Nepal turned to the only known religion of his time and in that part of the world, which would be Hinduism, which we just talked about in the previous lecture video. That makes a lot of sense. And so for the next 7 years, he dove into Hinduism. He followed all the physical and spiritual disciplines. And yet, at the end of 7 years, this didn't bring him peace either. He had lived on both extremes, all-out excess and all-out deprivation. His awakening, in brief, was maybe there's a middle way between these two extremes. And that's what he focused on. And when he focused on that on the night of Great Awakening, this happened at Bodh Gaya, it appeared to him or came to him that that middle way, the way to find it, is to release ourselves from our attachments of suffering. If you take away the attachments we have to suffering, then ergo, you take away suffering. So, hang in there. So, Buddhism is a middle way of approaching life, deprivation, and suffering and excess. It is not so much a belief system as it is a tool. One of my favorite authors of religion, Clyde Holloway, says it this way: Buddhism is a practice, not a creed. It is something to do rather than something to believe. Okay, what are the key Buddha scriptures? Well, Siddhartha Gautama summarized his main tenets of Buddhism in his first sermon, which translates setting in motion the wheel of truth. And that sermon is articulated then in 4 noble truths, which are the bedrock of Buddhist thought and practice. Now, I'll walk you through those 4 noble truths, but let me first kind of say it my way. I'm not nearly as profound as Buddha. But The classic case is, let's say that you walk out of wherever you are right now and you fall into a 10-foot hole that you can't get out of, and the bottom there's a little bit of water and it's dark and it's cold and there's a snake. Okay? Is that a place you want to be? No. Well, in the Buddhist thought now, philosophy, I would ask you, well, why don't you want to be there? And you would say, well, because, look, I'm cold. I don't like it dark. I don't like being in a hole. And I don't like snakes. And a Buddhist would say, so you're suffering because you have come to condition yourself that cold is bad, dark is bad, and snakes are bad. What if you learned to analyze and not react? What if you could, in your mind, start to say to yourself, holes aren't that bad. And if I can convince myself or train myself, discipline's probably the best word, to come across holes and know that they're not bad, then if I fall into a hole, I will no longer be suffering because I've lost the attachment that equated hole to suffering and discomfort. I could do that for snakes. I could do that for cold. I could do that pretty much to all suffering and any sort of existential crisis that comes my way. If I can learn to detach whatever I've associated with that thing of pain or suffering, then I've detached myself from pain and suffering. See what Holloway means when he says that Buddhism is a practice, not a creed so much. It's not something to do so much as it is a way to believe. But here are the Four Noble Truths, with that illustration kind of as to get you thinking in the right direction. The thesis is there's a relationship between my suffering and my attachments or my desires. I've already explained that to you. So the first noble truth is suffering exists. There is in all of us a failure of satisfied desires. Every day I'm going to face some sort of desire that I don't have, so I'm suffering. I'm hungry, I'm cold, I'm alone, whatever. Suffering exists. A priori. Noble truth number one. Noble truth number two, suffering is caused by attachments to desires. A thirst. I'm suffering because I am thirsty and I don't have water. I've attached my desire to water based out of Noble Truth 1 that I don't have water. So Noble Truth 1, suffering exists, period. Noble Truth number 2, suffering is caused by my attachments to a desire. I want water. I want out of this hole. Noble Truth number 3, it is possible then to release those attachments and then realize the potential to reduce suffering. It's possible to release our attachments and realize the potential then to reduce suffering. And the key there is in my mind, in my body, to release those conditioned attachments to desires related to suffering. And then Noble Truth number 4 lays out, how am I going to do this? How am I going to release these attachments? Well, an 8-fold path. It just got confusing, so let me explain that again. The first sermon of Buddha is a sermon that we can summarize as the 4 Noble Truths. 1, suffering exists, period. Noble Truth number 2, suffering is caused by my attachments to desires. I want out of the hole. I want the snake to go away. I want water, okay? Suffering is caused by attachment to my desires. Noble Truth number 3, it's possible to release our attachment and then realize the potential to reduce suffering. Being in a hole isn't so bad. I can learn To be cold is just as comfortable as being lukewarm. Okay? Reduce somehow attachments, to overgeneralize all of this. And then the fourth noble truth is an eightfold path, a prescription of how I can release these attachments. The middle way. You can read about those in your own reading, but the eightfold path, just to list them off, is right belief, a right resolve, right speech, right behavior, right occupation, right effort, right contemplation, and right concentration. You see, those are all ways that I can learn to analyze first before I react. And when I analyze, I can release desires and attachments and realize then the potential to limit my suffering. It's absolutely fascinating. It's a wonderful religion. Like I said, it's the world's fourth largest. As we continue our trek of religions geographically through the world, and I hope that this has piqued your interest. So the symbol of Buddhism then, you've seen it, is that wheel with 8 spokes for the eightfold path attached to the 4 noble truths of Siddhartha Gautama, who later became known as Buddha, the one who awoke to find out that the secret to life and to happiness is the middle way between the 2 extremes. And the middle way to reduce suffering is to discipline the way we think about attachments. I hope that that will stimulate you to your reading in your own textbook to dive in more about the riches of Buddhism.